Different forms of art, media, and entertainment have their own ways of defining generations. For games, it's console generations. Think PlayStation 1 to PlayStation 2 and so on. For the visual arts, it's centuries or periods, depending on who you ask. Think Renaissance or modern art. But for film, it's decades. And although the lines between generational improvements and themes can be fairly blurred when it comes to cinema, we still wanted to take a look back at the times and determine what were the 5 most important decades for movies. We are now in 2021, and we all know that 2020 was a defining year for the film industry because of how the world stopped. And because cinemas closed down temporarily, leaving many studios with no choice but to push their films back until they reopen. We also saw some big announcements that are bound to change the film industry for at least the foreseeable future. The biggest one being the Warner Bros. Partnership with HBO Max and how every movie they release in 2021 will be released in theaters and on the streaming platform simultaneously. Whether these changes will be good or bad, we won't know until the future. But we can already see that the 2020s aren't off to a great start for us movie lovers. But luckily, we have over 100 years of glorious cinema to cover, so let's go over the 5 most important decades for movies. But before we dive in, I just want to ask all of you to subscribe and hit the like button. I really appreciate it. I really enjoy making these kinds of videos about movies and films, and this one especially was very informative to me and I learned a lot. So yeah, let's dive in. Although one could argue that the most important decades for movies are the ones where new technological advancements push the industry forward, we wanted to take a look at the film industry as a whole and decided to look at 3 different categories when deciding what were the 5 most important decades for movies. The first category being technological advancements and innovation. Were there any new formats or technologies that were either invented or became widely used in movies during a decade that changed the film landscape going forward? Our second category is stylization and direction. Were there any iconic directors that burst onto the scene during a specific decade? Were there any new techniques in cinematography, lighting, and direction that paved the road for future filmmakers to use and abuse? And finally, our third category is, what are some of the great movies that came out during that decade? This isn't just about being the highest rated, it's about being iconic, revolutionary, and memorable. Our list is in chronological order because there are some really great decades for films and it will be difficult to rank them from least to most important. So let's begin. Now I know you could argue that the most important decade for movies was the one where the movie camera was invented. Like I said earlier, we were not only thinking about the technologies available, but also what was done with those technologies. And for this reason, we decided to leave the late 1800s out of the race because although they were extremely important, not much was done with the camera that resembles modern day cinema until the later years. So our first decade on the list is the 1930s. The 30s weren't only home to the Great Depression and the decade that brought us the Second World War. They were also one of the most important and defining decades in film. Signifying the start of the golden age of Hollywood, we got movies like Scarface, Gone with the Wind, Wizard of Oz, City Lights, Modern Times, M, Make Way for Tomorrow, and Grand Illusion. During this decade, movie studios began to have big influence over their movies, which for better or for worse is still prevalent today. From a technology standpoint, the 1930s were also very important, not because they introduced new technologies, but because they both refined and pushed these technologies into the mainstream. Yes, we know the 1910s introduced Technicolor, but it wasn't until the 30s before we saw a new 3-film strip Technicolor process called Technicolor 3, which took color film to a new level. During this decade, color film began being used more widely and it helped pave the road for future color in film. The 1930s adoption and refinement of color film can be summarized in this one simple scene. We also didn't see the invention of talkies during this decade. That was during the 1920s, but the 30s took talkies global. Now, for those of you who don't know what talkies are, they are movies with people talking and sound that was more than just some background soundtrack synchronized to the action. Our second decade is the 1950s, and this decade produced a ton of great movies. In fact, at the time of making this video, 40 movies from the Letterboxd Top 250 narrative feature films are from this decade alone. 12 Angry Men, The Seventh Seal, High Noon, Seven Samurai, Sunset Boulevard, and Singing in the Rain, just to name a few. But this isn't the only reason the 1950s made our list. This decade was significant to the future success of the film industry because during this decade, the movie industry was faced with many challenges, one of which was the rise of television. This was one of the main reasons there was a big drop in movie revenues, which resulted in film studios having to fight back and try harder to bring audiences to theaters. They had a fear that audiences would prefer to stay at home in front of the tube and that the glory years of film that were encapsulated during the 30s were coming to an end. During this time, we also saw movies begin targeting younger audiences, and actors that related to these younger audiences were at the peak of their popularity. Actors like James Stewart, John Wayne, Marlon Brando, and yes, of course, James Dean. The 1950s were also the peak Alfred Hitchcock years. Now, I don't have much to say about this because I already assumed that you know who Hitchcock was and why he was important to film, but having directed movies like Vertigo, Rear Window, North by Northwest, and many more during this decade, it seemed like he was on fire. And finally, this decade was categorized as the golden age of science fiction, with many A and B movies coming out during this time that redefined the genre and pushed the industry forward. The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2. Enough said. Okay, I'm just kidding. But on the same note, the 1970s brought us some of the most iconic movies of all time. The Godfathers, Apocalypse Now, Alien, Chinatown, Star Wars, Jaws, A Clockwork Orange, and many more came from this decade. We also saw the rise of Hong Kong martial arts films from the likes of Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan. And during this decade, we were introduced to a bunch of what were called movie brats. Now, what are movie brats, you may ask? Well, movie brats are a generation of popular, successful American film directors who were mostly film school graduates. You may have heard of some of these directors, but they included big names like George Lucas, John Carpenter, Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Woody Allen, Steven Spielberg, David Lynch, James Cameron, Ron Howard, and more. That is a crazy list of directors that are both iconic and revolutionary to the film industry. The 70s also marked the beginning of huge blockbusters in Hollywood. When I think back to some of my favorite years for blockbusters, I usually think back to the 80s. But the 80s wouldn't be what they were if it wasn't for the work done in the late 70s. Movies like Star Wars, Alien, and Jaws were just some of the movies that ushered in the era of huge blockbuster films of the 80s. Movies were pushing special effects to new limits, and George Lucas founded Industrial Light and Magic in 1975, which went on to revolutionize the visual effects industry, enabling some of those 80s blockbusters to push visual effects even further. Home to iconic movies like Titanic, Jurassic Park, Lion King, Toy Story, Terminator 2, Goodfellas, Pulp Fiction, Fight Club, Forrest Gump, and more, the 90s were a decade near and dear to my heart. Not only because I was born during that time, but also because as a kid, I got to see the return of Star Wars, lived and breathed the Disney Renaissance, witnessed the rise of computer animated films, and experienced movies that use special effects and CGI in ways that were never before imaginable. With Toy Story being the first fully computer animated movie ever, it introduced audiences to a brand new type of movie, and this led to the rise of Pixar and the founding of DreamWorks. The 90s were known as the decade of money, mega spending, and special effects, and many iconic directors had their debut during this decade. There was Quentin Tarantino with movies like Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, and Jackie Brown. Paul Thomas Anderson with movies like Heart 8, Boogie Nights, and Magnolia. And David Fincher, who undoubtedly came out with his best film during this decade, Alien 3. Oh, and he also directed some lesser-known movies like The Game, Seven, and Fight Club. Also during this decade, many Hong Kong action cinema stars migrated to Hollywood, such as Jackie Chan and Jet Li. And finally, we also had some huge-name actors dominating this decade, such as Arnold Schwarzenegger, Julia Roberts, Jim Carrey, and Leonardo DiCaprio, to name a few. And we have finally arrived at the last entry on our list, the 2010s. Home to most of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the new Star Wars trilogy, the 2010s packed a big punch, both at the box office and in critical acclaim. Frozen, Parasite, Whiplash, Moonlight, Coco, Mad Max, Inception, Django Unchained, and Hateful Eight are only some of the movies to come out during this decade. And although the 2010s are recent, they've drastically changed the movie landscape for the long haul. This decade popularized the idea of the cinematic universe with the likes of Marvel and DC, but really, mostly Marvel. Movies were no longer just producing sequels, but franchises were now crossing over in ways that we've never seen before. The 2010s saw huge leaps forward in diversity, not only in movies but across multiple forms of media. During this decade, we saw the white Oscars boycott, which, among other things, was a big part of why we now have new rules for the Oscars with diversity in mind. During this decade, we also saw the introduction and meteoric rise of video on demand. Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, and Disney Plus were only some of the streaming services that came out and changed how the average consumer watches movies. With the introduction of these streaming services, movie and TV shows became more accessible than ever, and because of this, we saw a decrease in piracy, but we also saw the decline of DVD and physical media sales. This decade was also a decade that showed us anyone can be a filmmaker. It was no longer reserved for a special few, but anyone with an idea can make a movie. We saw a lot of independent film success during this decade. The independent film studio A24 put out hit after hit with movies like The Vivitch, Moonlight, The Florida Project, 8th Grade, Uncut Gems, and Mid-90s, among many others. And with camera technologies getting better and cheaper, a movie could be made with a smartphone and an idea. We actually saw feature films coming out that were made with smartphones, like Unsane and Tangerine. Thanks for watching. The 2020s are going to be interesting to say the least. We've already seen huge changes to the film industry, but we won't know the full impact until the future. Now, hopefully this decade will push the industry forward as opposed to holding it back, but only time will tell. If you like this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Let us know if you agree with our choices, and until next time, have a good one.